Thank you, Jim. Our next speaker is also, this is his first appearance here at the Forecast Conference, Keith Fontenot, who I think is most famous for being Jim Capretta's first boss. Between then and today, he has actually had a distinguished career in government, both at the Office of Management and Budget, where he was the I always want to say it's Associate Director for Health during the development and implementation of the Affordable Care Act. He had a stint at the Congressional Budget Office, and he is now Managing Director for Government Relations and Public Policy with Hooper, Lundy, and Bookman, PC. Keith, welcome.
If I got this right. Well, Jim always tells the first part of the story. What he doesn't tell is the second part. The second part is I came back to OMB. I popped around a couple of places, came back to OMB as a senior career civil servant, handling the health desk, basically, Medicare, Medicaid, related issues. I get this phone call. Keith, guess what's going to happen? I go, what's that? He says, I'm coming over as your boss. I had never been so happy I gave him a raise in all my life. But seriously, what you see here is something that's gone on. Wendell Primus, I first worked with in 1982. Joe and I worked together in 1982. So all of us have probably worked together and known each other for something on the order of 30 plus years. I mean, it's a little scary to think, but you're very lucky. I'm telling you, these are great people. They know their stuff. Sometimes they're dead wrong, but they really know their stuff. And I respect them all greatly, and I consider them all good friends. So my forecast will start out almost exactly as Jim's did. What's going to happen in 2016? Nothing. But that's not quite true. You'll see a continuing resolution that punts everything past the election. Probably in the lame duck, you will see some movement around getting appropriations bills done so the next president doesn't have a dead dinosaur on their doorstep. And you'll probably see some smaller bills, things like funding for Zika, perhaps something coming out of the Cures bill, FDA and the other things, and then everything else will be tied up in the next president. On the other hand, I agree with Jim about 300%. What you've got going on the administrative side, I'm sure all of you are on these CMS listservs, and I get deluged every day by a new this, a new reg, a new whatever. This will go on pretty intensely. It'll probably slow down right before the election because the administration won't want to stir up the waters at that point in time. It'll then accelerate post-election as the administration looks to lock down all the things they can before they leave. And this will continue like a glacier. There are so many authorities buried in these laws now that the administration will work on for years to come. So with that, I'm going to touch quickly on the budgetary stuff. I don't have much to say. Much more to add here. I think Bill Hoagland said it beautifully, as did Jim Glassman. Talk a little bit about the landscape, the Affordable Care Act, Medicare Advantage, and then come to the real changes in fee-for-service and what's going on in value for. So the big issue, as Jim hit on, it's the aging of the baby boom, right? But when I say the aging of the baby boom, I had a demographer professor once that talked about the python of time, and it would swallow a pig or an egg or whatever, and it would move through time. That is not what's going on here. Not in the short run, and we can't think about it that way. What's going on here is society's aging. Fertility has declined, and the fundamental ratio of older people to working people has changed. And that means we have to think about the budget issues and healthcare and all these things a lot differently. He also talked about, and Bill was, I think, dead on, what this means. If you look at the ratio, look at outlays and spending over time, what you'll see is it bounces around a lot. People tend to look at long-run averages when they look at those things. So long as the budget's within about 3% of GDP in terms of a deficit, you're okay because your debt doesn't explode. Debt is a risk. If you're highly leveraged, you have a greater risk. Okay? My point is that I think Bill Hoagland's exactly right. We have to rethink how we think about the budget. We have to rethink all of this in the context of an aging population. Second point here, and he alluded to this as well, the discretionary share of the budget is what has suffered mightily. In 2012, I was working for Jack Lew at the time, and we were negotiating mightily with the Hill over the debt ceiling. We did not succeed in getting a plan, so what we got instead was a big sequester. And the big sequester, what it really did was scrunch down on discretionary spending. This is the National Institutes of Health, FDA, budget for CMS, education, Head Start. It's all the things you think about when you think about what you might need to be thinking about in society today. The debt, I don't need to belabor, but I want to make a couple of points. So there's some great work that's coming out of Brookings. This is another commercial since I'm a visiting scholar there. By Doug Elmendorf, who's the former CEO director, and Louise Shaner, a former Fed economist. Everybody agrees the budget's structurally out of whack, and it has to be dealt with. The question of how, the balance of taxes and so forth, and the mix and the timeline for doing that. Doug, who has for years I've known him, and he's consistently made the point about the risks to the debt, said that we are now really in an era of persistently low interest rates, and that lets you think about all the history and the averages that people like to assume should continue going forward in a slightly different way. If the historical average of debt was 30%, 36% of GDP roughly in the post-war period, we might be able to tolerate a little more in today's era, right? Because at the interest rates we've got, but the risk is over time, you need to be on a path to do better. And so that path, I want to echo what Jim said about the campaign. What people say now on all these things does matter. It will come back. And what's not happening, I don't see, is apart from Mr. Kasich, who doesn't seem to be leading in the polls, I don't see anybody else talking about this issue and how to adapt to it over time. Okay, so the landscape. So the election year makes it difficult to do anything. We know that. The shift of leadership in the House, we don't yet know how that's going to play out. I would note that most of the bills that passed in the last couple of years really passed with a lot of Democratic votes. Is that a pattern that will continue? Is that a pattern that can sustain? If I were doing a scorecard of myself, about 2 years ago, I was predicting nothing would happen. And I was absolutely stunned when they passed both the budget deal and MACRA. And that was a success for leadership, both for Mr. Boehner and Ms. Pelosi, who figured out how to do it, and for Mr. McConnell, who saw wisely the need to get this stuff off the agenda so he didn't have a train wreck right before the next election. The administration is going to drive to lock in their policies, I mentioned. Bill touched on this, the cycling of a Senate. So you could imagine very easily a scenario where you have a Democratic president, Democratic Senate, and with almost no margin, so the 60-vote problem in the Senate looms large, and a Republican House. So you got two questions. Can you get anything through the Senate? Second question is, will the House go along? Tip O'Neill famously in 1981, when Ronald Reagan was elected, said, the man won the election, we're not going to stand in his way. And he went on to work with him in a very constructive way. That's the biggest question to me about what happens if you have a Democratic president. Regardless, whatever it is, 2017 will be legislatively active. Murray raised this kind of cycle that goes on where you have about a year and a half where the president's agenda dominates. Then you hit a midterm election, it shuts down, then everybody's running for election again, you have a little open window. Well, that's exactly right. So you have about a year and a half where whoever the new president is, that will be the dominant agenda. On the Affordable Care Act side, I'm heartened to see that Jim and I have somewhat different views on this issue, but I'm heartened to see that a little more positive note in his voice here. The point here I would make is that the baseline has changed. Everything is judged against where you are. We now have 18 million more people insured. Uninsurance rates down 37%. Healthcare costs are down, and we can all debate how much is due to the Affordable Care Act, but some of it is for sure, and certainly on the Medicare side, a good bit of it. Lots fewer hospital readmissions, lots fewer hospital-acquired admissions, lots more focus on value. Okay? Now, that's not solely due to the Affordable Care Act. That started a long time ago, but it certainly gives it a big kick. It's just the cost growth, which we know is down. I want to point out one thing. Mr. Gable early mentioned something about cost-sharing subsidies. So we had the first case on the individual mandate, or excuse me, the penalties, or whatever they were called, Halbig, and then we had the second Supreme Court case called the King v. Burwell. There is a third case working its way through the court systems that is equally serious in my view, that challenges the authority for cost-sharing subsidies. You probably haven't heard a lot about it, but it's very serious, so keep your eyes on it. It has two key issues. First one is standing. Can the House sue the president? That's a big legal issue. I'm not a lawyer. I won't dwell too much on that. But cost-sharing subsidies basically buy up the actuarial value of a plan in the range of about 100 to 250% of poverty. So you can think about it, basically buys down the out-of-pockets and the deductibles and the coinsurance for people. So it raises the actuarial value of the plans very substantially from 100 to 250% of poverty. 80% of the people in the exchanges are in that band. So I thought about titling this slide, Dog Catches Car. So if the House sues and happens to win, what happens here is fairly stunning, okay? And all of this can play out when you talk about scenarios around the Affordable Care Act. This is a wild card. The insurers worry that they'll be forced to offer this without getting reimbursed. Behind it all, it's a complicated legal issue, but behind it all, there's, 80% of your people in this band, okay? Let's jump to Medicare Advantage for a moment. The issues around that have changed fundamentally, where now we have 30% of the beneficiaries there, and it's growing probably to 40%, maybe more in the next few years. On average, no premium growth in the short term. 65% of the enrollees are now in the 4- and 5-star plans. That right there is a signal that somebody, be it the Congress or the administration, is going to start looking at what 4- and 5-star plans mean. But also, if you think about the legislation Jim mentioned, and I'll talk about in a second, MACRA and the physician and the pay-for-value things, the joint bundling demonstrations, and all these kinds of other issues, I will tell you, I would expect a lot of that to bleed over into the Medicare Advantage world. If you're a Medicare Advantage organization contracting with people, you're going to have to deal with this. You're going to have to rewrite your contracts to figure out how you're going to deal with this kind of stuff. Or if you are in the fee-for-service world, and you're a physician, for example, you would like to see, I'm sure, that Medicare Advantage count as what's called an alternative payment model. So my point is, even if you're on one side of the fence or the other, you better pay attention to what's going on the other side. Another interesting thing, CMS is testing a value-based insurance design. Medicare Advantage is not a lightly regulated enterprise. It's very heavily regulated. If you're in that world, they have very strict network adequacy standards. Well, they're looking at ways very slowly and very cautiously to move off of some of that. I won't go through a lot of the details. You have it in the slides. So the high enrollment means you're not going to see, in my view, a replay of what you saw in 2009. Okay. However, the formula dynamics in high Medicare Advantage penetration areas, you now have a payment rate for the Medicare Advantage plan based on the fee-for-service in that. If half your people are in Medicare Advantage, it starts to not make so much sense. Okay. Risk adjustment is going to remain an issue. You'll see action there both on particularly on the administrative side as much as they can, maybe more on the legislative side. And prescription drugs is going to be a big political issue through the debate. I love that the earlier gentleman commented that you'll see lower drug price increases in an election year, particularly as people rattle scabbards about negotiating prices and controlling drug prices. But the fact of the matter here is that there are relatively few practical solutions. It's very difficult, unless you want to go muck with patent laws and all kinds of other things, to actually really drive down drug prices. Now, the jawboning does work to a degree. That doesn't mean there are not things you could do that would save federal money, but if you want to think about this as total health care costs, there's a lot of work that needs to be done there. One of the big debates is around paying for value. I still am not yet sure how that works. Benchmark caps and bonuses is an interesting issue. There's certain areas of the country where Medicare Advantage payments are strongly limited because of something known as the benchmark cap. It says you can't be paid more than you were paid under the old law. And so in certain counties where this bites, it bites very hard because a plan that gets a bonus then gets the bonus clipped way back. I suspect you'll see that MedPAC is called, the Medicare Payment Advisory Commission has married those two and called for action. You could see something legislatively in that domain. So I'm not going to recount a ton of the history, just a little anecdote. My dad was a hospital administrator way back in the 80s when IPPS came in, and I remember he called me up and he says, "You got us now, son." And then about 2 years later, he said, "Well, I think we figured out how to work with this system." And it was just an example for me of how much, as you go through this, you create effects, some which you don't intend, and how it just morphs over time. So this whole shift to value has been going on for years and years and years, is my point. It accelerated a lot. Early in the 2000s, Jim Capretta and I were working together at OMB, And a guy named Tom Scully, who was head of CMS, came in and said, hey, we got a great demo. We're going to pay hospitals to report quality measures. It was something that had worked out with Premier, and they did it, and guess what? The hospitals reported all the quality measures, and guess what? They started giving people aspirin and flu shots and pneumonia vaccines and the like. People responded. Well, pretty soon those measures and that whole system became some part of a system, and it kind of went on and built on it. This is going to go on for a long, long time. The big question to me in all this movement is whether or not we really reshape the economics of what's happening on below this, or whether it's a fee-for-service chassis with a fancier body and a better engine or something like that. You know, will it bring down costs? I don't know yet. Will it get more value for the dollar, and is that worth doing? Absolutely, yes, unequivocally. So macro. So one of the things I predicted would not happen happened, and that was the repeal of SGR, the sustainable growth rate. What that means is the Congress no longer every year has to go scrounging around. Wendell and I must have done this a dozen times, scrounging around for offsets to pay for an extension of physician payments at the current level, and we don't have this kind of silliness about a 25% cut. But that's the headline. The much more important part is what Jim mentioned, which is the underlying tracks for payment. And I will tell you, I see this as an unlevel playing field. It basically says if you're in a fee-for-service system, you're in an eat-what-you-kill mode, and that's going to be hard. So the tilt is to move everybody into an alternative payment model, okay? And I have several charts here that will tell you much more about that if you're interested. It's a huge delegation of authority to CMS, okay? It's a work in progress. We don't know what all these alternative models are. We're making them up as we go along. We have a few vetted demos in CMS, but remember also all these agencies, just like the IRS, as Mr. Gable indicated, are fairly squeezed by their limited resources. Are the deadlines realistic? There's going to be a scramble, I will tell you. But watch this one if you're in Medicare Advantage or if you're in fee-for-service, because it will affect you at some point. So this system is all moving and changing. What we don't know is where and how fast, and particularly the quality measure side, what you saw with AHIP and CMS coming together to work out an agreement on how to smooth measures is actually a great development. That was my point about government governance issues. We do this in a kind of loose way through the Quality Forum and all these I say they're really private organizations, but they get some government funding. But this whole process is going to have to be regularized. Some guy, Provost at Hopkins, actually called for creating something like an SEC here. I don't think that's quite the answer, but I do think we need to think a lot more about how we do this. The joint bundling demo, this will go national is my prediction. I have no reason to know that except that you can just see the pattern. There's an explicit authority. The Secretary may, through rulemaking, expand, including nationwide, something she finds effective. It'll change the way hospitals deal, particularly with post-acute care providers, I think, and it'll lead to creating more networks and more things. So watch that. I don't know if they'll get it nationwide this year, but they will. The most startling thing here is that Congress said nothing, almost not a peep. Hundreds of comments from across the nation. Congress sat by and said, you're doing the right thing, keep going. But they didn't exactly cheer it, but they didn't do anything about it. Somebody mentioned this ACO question. I think one of the things you're going to need to see there in terms of skin in the game is steering. How do you steer bennies one place or another with co-pays or with other kinds of incentives? We have not seen that yet. Chronic care is another world. The Senate Finance Committee is really trying to get something going here. And you know what? It's hard. It's really hard. It's difficult to demonstrate savings from programs like this and to get through the scrutiny of people like me in my old life at CBO. But this will not go away, and it's possible they could come up with some things here they could agree upon. So we get to 2017 and the new president. I think a lot of this we've covered already. Will there be an entitlement reform effort? I suspect that if you're a new president, one of the things you're going to think about, whereas if you launch hard on this, will you have a second term as a new president? Because this is a big, big undertaking. We don't have, a guy named Daniel Yankelovich years ago wrote a book called Coming to Public Judgment. He talks about opinion formation and democracy. I don't think we have a consensus on what we need to do. I see a few other baby boomers in this audience, We might get through this without getting clobbered. I don't know. We should get clobbered a little bit, would be my own opinion. But this is the issue of our time. Will be Social Security, will be health programs. I can assure you there'll be a lot of fighting around all this. Will we deal with the MA formula dynamics I mentioned? Perhaps, but I don't see a lot of ardor to do it right now. One of the things that happened in the Affordable Care Act is we built into the law permanent reductions in the market baskets. That means there's not a lot of other options out there. You can't just nip a market basket. You have to go change something. So one of the things I think I see coming is with all the disparate measures in the hospital world, you could see a consolidated system, not unlike MACRA, that put those all together and tried to harmonize, the readmissions measures, the hospital-acquired conditions, and everything else. You'll see a gradually tightening of networks and everything over time. When CMS stood up the Affordable Care Act, they naturally took a somewhat looser handle on a lot of the rules. Some gentlemen mentioned this earlier as well, to get people to participate. That will tighten over time. More aggressive use of waivers will be a big issue depending on who the president is. Even if he decided he didn't want to do entitlement reform, this will be what helps states take up the Medicaid option, or in a Republican presidency could be what leads to more devolution of control. Medicaid, my prediction is everybody will come in eventually. You can expect to see a lot more value-based insurance design, including in the exchanges, I think, eventually. And you'll see CHIP and community health center funding extended. This will be in 2017, not 2016. The caddy tax, the Cadillac tax, I am not, I'll leave that one to Wendell. I'm not quite sure. I'm not sure it'll make it, to be honest with you. And my big hope is that we get past repeal and replace and get on to what I would call refine. So thank you for your time.